The 2-hour WWE Raw experiment is back, and it may not have been as smooth of a transition as some people would have thought, but there were still some notable things on the show to discuss on this week's Raw, and it was headlined by the World Heavyweight Championship match, Gunther defending against Sami Zayn, and yes, the Ring General able to retain the championship, and that makes it official. It'll be Gunther versus Cody Rhodes at Crown Jewel for the new Crown Jewel title in about a month's time. But before we get into everything that happened on Raw, I keep telling you guys, I'm on Twitter now, at WrestleBlake. Be sure to follow me there. Lots of you guys already have. We're having lots of fun discussions on there, past, present, future WWE stuff. So be sure to follow me on there. Click the link in the description below and in that comment that's pinned there in the comments section. But let's talk about this week's Raw, and let's start with the main event. It was Gunther getting the win over Sami Zayn to successfully retain the championship. And look, I mean, this was a scenario where I know people were talking about, hey, maybe this is where Goldberg is going to reappear and possibly cost Gunther the championship. Sami Zayn gets his big win. We do Cody versus Sami at Crown Jewel. Sami's the world champion. Jey's the Intercontinental champion. Lots of ways you can go with that story-wise. But it was hard to really see Gunther ever losing this championship in the Triple H era, which, again, remember how long Gunther was the Intercontinental champion. Not saying he's going to be the world champion for that long, but it's still Gunther. And him, able to win this match clean, straight up. And we've kind of seen that too. Remember, I know sometimes there is kind of, certainly a possibility you're going to get interference and those kind of things in different matches. But when it comes to these kind of matches, it does seem like whether it was the, Jey Bron Breakker match or this match here, like when you have these main event type matches that are for world titles, intercontinental titles, it seems like that they've done a pretty good job, at least recently, of making sure the action is in the ring. Like they're not pulling any outside shenanigans and that kind of stuff in these kind of matches, at least. So, it was straight up. Gunther gets the win. Sami had that one burst of energy there where you thought, all right, maybe he's going to find a way to pull this off. And the facial expressions were great after Sami kicks out of the powerbomb at one. Gunther's backing up against the ropes. And again, I think that's what makes Gunther so good is his ability just to, without saying a word, using those facial expressions to really tell the story that, is this about to happen to me again? I could not beat Sami Zayn. The blemish on my record. I could not beat him at WrestleMania 40. Is this about to happen again? You can kind of see that running through Gunther's mind as he's leaning against the ropes there after Sami kicks out at one. And, certainly that was something that I think that really stood out in this match. A great match, as you'd expect, between these two. But it's Gunther retaining, and I think now, like we said, it is making it official. It's going to be Gunther versus Cody Rhodes for the Crown Jewel title. I've said my thoughts on this championship. I just don't think it is, something that really feels like it's that meaningful in terms of anything to do with the storylines and all that. But hey, you're going to get a Cody versus Gunther match, right? And there are worse things you could have on a WWE PLE than Cody versus Gunther. So, you're going to get a good match out of it. It's just, again, I think the stakes that are involved, it's much different when you have the champion versus champion setting now. And this is just going to be an annual thing that really is going to factor into this one PLE. But coming out of it, what does it mean, really, for WWE storylines the rest of the year? Maybe not a whole lot. So, but still, like I said, you're going to get a good match, and this was the one we thought we would get. And I still think that Gunther versus Goldberg match is going to happen. I know people were wondering, is he going to interfere here? Something, immediate happens. And if you saw, Triple H put out the tweet showing, a bit of a conversation between him and Goldberg and talking about how they were going to talk again soon. So, I think as of right now, in my opinion, people are wondering, is it going to be Goldberg versus Gunther at Survivor Series? Is it going to be Goldberg versus Gunther at WrestleMania 41? I did see, I think, one of the reports out there that it was not slotted for either of those shows. So to me, I think there's value in doing the Goldberg versus Gunther match either on Saturday night's main event, the return to NBC in December, or you could do it on the first Raw on Netflix in January. I think those are perfectly fine places to do that match. But again, could WrestleMania 41 be a possibility if you're doing a big Goldberg retirement match? Certainly. Could certainly, I guess, be in the works potentially. But I think we're going to get that match. I know it's not one that people thought we were ever going to get, but I do think we're getting Goldberg versus Gunther at some point, but it's not going to be at Crown Jewel, and we know that's because it's Cody versus Gunther at that show. What's next for Sami? I think that's an interesting question coming out of this. As Sami had his world, championship opportunity here, comes up short. Jey's the Intercontinental Champion. We think Sami is going to be involved in the Bloodline versus Bloodline War Games match at Survivor Series, but now we kind of see, how does Sami get back into the picture? Do Roman Reigns and Jimmy Uso, how do they use Sami here to get Jey back? Maybe there's a lot of interesting things to do because Sami's kind of really, he's gone from losing the Intercontinental Championship, now he's lost the opportunity to win the world title. So you've got to feel like Sami is in sort of a place now where something's got to bring him back up. And is it possibly rejoining this whole thing with the Bloodline? How do they get there? Those are the questions we're still trying to figure out. But speaking of Cody Rhodes, quickly, he was on the show. And yes, he was also part of a bit of a technical glitch. Although I know some people are wondering, was it an angle and all this? But yeah, this, like I mentioned earlier, this didn't seem to be the most smoothest show from the technical side of things. But Cody was on this show, and really, other than him coming down, having the stare down with Gunther and talking to Sami Zayn backstage, Sami wanting to bring up what happened with Kevin Owens, Cody didn't want to talk about it. That was about it. That's all you got from Cody on this show. So really was there and nothing more than to do that. And just to quickly bring up, I know the spoilers are out there for next week's edition of Raw. Not that this ties into Cody, but I know the spoilers are out there for next week's Raw. We're not going to discuss those on here, but just a note, if you want to know what happened on next week's Raw, which is being taped or was taped because they're going on the UK tour, you can find those, I'm sure, online. So I may bring up a couple things to hint towards that, but for now, we're not going to discuss that. We're just going to discuss this show as it stands and go from there. So, all right, elsewhere on this week's show, you had CM Punk lead things off. Seth Rollins comes out and, Seth interrupts after Punk makes it sort of somewhat mysterious as to what his next direction is going to be, basically saying that, he was uncertain about his WWE future because, as we said, we knew a match like this was going to change CM Punk. It was also going to change Drew McIntyre, who was not on the show, and that's no surprise. I think Drew McIntyre deserves some time off here. Could be, lengthy. We'll find out. As for what's next with Drew, but with Punk, they did do the big tease with Seth Rollins coming out, them having, sort of the face-off in the aisle. And I, just in my opinion, I think that is not something that's going to happen in the immediate future. I think that's something that is more likely to happen way down the line at WrestleMania 41. Because, again, remember, they wanted to do Punk versus Rollins this past year at WrestleMania 40. The Punk injury prevented that from happening. I would probably say that to me feels like one of those matches that feels pretty solid for WrestleMania 41 unless they decide to do it earlier. And again, there are ways to get there, right? You could have Punk challenge Gunther for the world title at Survivor Series. Perhaps Rollins screws him out of the championship. You get the two that interact in the Royal Rumble somehow. Then that sort of leads you in that direction to where maybe one of them are the champion going into WrestleMania 41, or maybe Gunther is still the champ. And so I think that's one that, again, if you really think about this, The Rock comes back at Bad Blood to essentially tease the WrestleMania 41 main event, right? I mean, he's kind of teasing the idea that in some combination, those three guys, Rock, Cody, Reigns, are going to be involved in the WrestleMania 41 main event. And then on the Raw after Bad Blood, you have Punk and Rollins interacting. And Triple H, the long-term booking is there, right? Like, this isn't what it was towards the end of the Vince McMahon era where things were just by the fly, week in, week out. You just didn't know. Things were changing all the time. It seems like they do a pretty good job of months in advance, kind of, teasing the things that you're going to see down the road. And I would not be surprised at all if the little exchange here between Punk and Rollins was to set in motion, a match for them at WrestleMania 41. But again, there are options to do that beforehand too, if you want to get there. But kind of following up on that, Rollins calls out Bronson Reed, challenges him. I would think that's going to happen at Crown Jewel, but I suppose it could happen elsewhere. But that seems like one of those matches. If you're trying to find 5, remember, it's got to be 5 on Crown Jewel. That seems like one of those matches you could put on there with Rollins trying to get his revenge on Bronson Reed, who was not on the show, kind of selling what happened last week there as well. So something else about this show that I think was very interesting. The lack of a Judgment Day presence, right? I mean, think about how many Raws over the past couple years have really been dominated by the Judgment Day storyline. And tonight, you didn't have any of that. I mean, you had Raquel Rodriguez driving in Liv Morgan and Dominic Mysterio. And like I said, I don't want to spoil anything that happens next week, but I will say this. There's a very interesting main event for next week's edition of Raw, and there's one participant in particular, I think, in that main event may be a sign of things to come as to what WWE has planned for that participant. But there's my only tease if you don't want to be spoiled as to what's going to happen next week. But there wasn't really anything Judgment Day related except for, again, Liv and Dominic deciding they wanted to leave as soon as they got there, which I hate that they're spending this much gas money on driving to the arena and then turning around and leaving. But, Raquel being asked if she a part of the Judgment Day and all this, I told you guys, I just didn't think it was something where she was going to be an official member, even though maybe she's aligned with these two. I don't know. It just feels somewhat odd to me just to immediately kind of thrust her into the Judgment Day, but they're kind of seemingly playing with that because there wasn't a definitive answer here, and that was kind of the point of the angle, was to kind of give no answer as to whether Raquel was part of it, and Liv still saying, even when she loses, she wins, and, that's kind of how she's playing it. So Rhea, certainly coming for revenge. We know that on Raquel and Liv, so we're not done with that yet, but you have Raquel added to the mix here now. So now Rhea, has someone else to sort of interact with aside from just Liv and Dominic, which has been the case over the past several months, as we know. So, so that's going to continue, we know. And then, match-wise, Jey retains the championship against Xavier Woods. You still had Xavier Woods being pretty frustrated, as we know, coming out of this. Didn't want to shake Jey's hand, even though Kofi Kingston did. And then it's Bron Breakker, who has been thrust right back into this Intercontinental Championship picture now as he goes and just spears everybody. He spears all three, Jey, Xavier Woods, and Kofi Kingston. And so, that kind of sets up an interesting dynamic here. And keep in mind, too, Jey Uso is supposed to be on NXT tonight. So curious to know, if there's some sort of reaction there. Or is Breakker also there, too? And there's, kind of an interesting thing you could do on that. But, so Bron Breakker, you would think, coming back for the Intercontinental Championship now. He did do the tease last week, wasn't it, with Gunther saying he's going to be coming for the world title soon enough. But maybe for now, are we going to get that big rematch between Breakker and Jey, and when does that happen? That's an interesting question, I think, because clearly he set his sights back on this, held up the championship after he did the spear. So, so Bron Breakker kind of thrust back into that now. So, that was something else you had here. And again, match-wise, Sheamus and Pete Dunne beat the hell out of each other, just as we thought they would in the Donnybrook match. And I don't know if you guys saw the visuals. I don't know if they put it on WWE Twitter or whatever, but there was the image about, Sheamus is back and just brutal after, that match. And, of course, they went through the table. That was a big spot. And so, that was, and it was also very creative, right? Sheamus is basically, he's got the zip ties on his hands and can't even hold his balance as he's doing the bro kick, but he finds a way to get the win over Pete Dunne, which we knew Sheamus would kind of be the person that would get the win out of this. But I'm curious to see what they do with Sheamus, too, next. He feels like someone that, you figure is probably going to be in that Intercontinental Championship picture. Kind of, again, someone else who just, you're going to get solid work out of Sheamus all the time. And so I think it's going to be kind of fascinating to see what they do next with him. I'm kind of scrolling down here. Again, and we're going to talk about a couple of the other things that weren't exactly match or angle related in a second. But, you had the 10-woman tag here. It was one of those where I think, and we can kind of tie this into some of the stuff that, we look at coming out of the show, the 2-hour, 3-hour transition. It did feel like on this show, there was a definite work in progress feel to trying to make sure everything got on this show. And again, that's understandable because you're going from 3 hours to 2 hours. And I think you certainly have to keep in mind, and commercials I know are also a big topic here. You had a couple matches where you'd have a commercial, you'd have another commercial, you get about 2 minutes of action, 3 minutes of action, it's commercial, and then it really disrupts the flow. And you could see that in a couple of these matches here on the show. And I know some people were saying it felt like there were more commercials on the 2-hour Raw than there was 3-hour Raw. But that did allow 3-hour Raws to flow a little bit better, even though they were long shows. Having kind of that, built-in buffer to do the commercials, knowing it's a 3-hour show, you have some matches that can go longer. You did have some matches here that went shorter than certainly they would have gone had you done, the 2-hour or the 3-hour show. So I think that was the thing where timing and flow, it's definitely still a work in progress. I think that's for sure. And like I said, keep in mind, they've been doing 3-hour Raws for 13 plus years, or 12 plus years, excuse me. It's there is going to probably be that initial sort of transition that it's gonna, this show's gonna go through to where then they start to find their groove again. But I think this was one where there were definitely, places where you're thinking, boy, that disrupts the flow a little bit. They're definitely having to rush here. They're having to rush there to try to get all this in. And again, like the 10-woman tag, I think was certainly kind of an example of that. Lyra Valkyria got the win in that one, but it did feel like one of those where, hey, they're trying to get everything that they can in here because of the stories that they built up over the past little while with all of these competitors, with the Pure Fusion Collective and everyone else involved in this match. But they just didn't have the time, right? They just didn't have the time to work with. You have commercials thrown in and all that. So that's something I think that we'll have to adjust to and see kind of how that plays out the rest of the way. But yeah, I mean, look, again, I think that was this week's Raw. I mean, you had the Miz and R-Truth stuff. Miz challenging Truth to a match next week. Again, you can read the spoilers as to what happens with everything there. But I think that's kind of where we are. Wyatt Six, clearly, seemingly, they had the the symbol and everything flash on the screen during the backstage interaction between Karrion Kross and the Miz and Truth. So clearly going to be some involvement there. But yeah, I mean, this is, again, it's a 2-hour Raw, so you don't have as much in there, but you had some of the meaningful stuff coming out of it, and now it really is, all about the road to Crown Jewel. And I did want to bring up something real quickly, too. I was talking about this on Twitter, and I know it got shared a lot, but, again, this was the first 3-hour Raw since July the 16th, or this was the first 2-hour Raw, since July 16th, 2012. The last card for that episode, if you want to go back and look at, that, I'm going to read it off to you, okay? So prepare yourselves for this. Here was the card from July 16th, 2012. So if you're thinking this was a Raw that maybe was a little disappointing in your eyes, or maybe did not flow as well as you thought, keep in mind, here's what the last one was, the last 2-hour Raw. So Kofi Kingston and R-Truth defeated the Primetime Players to retain the WWE Tag Team Championship. So Kofi and Truth were the champions at the time. 7 minutes and 45 seconds was the match time on that one. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Alberto Del Rio defeated Zack Ryder in 1 minute and 30 seconds. Rikishi defeated Heath Slater in 1 minute and 10 seconds. And as I noticed some people on Twitter, that's when Rikishi made the return. Heath Slater was calling out, all the people during that era. And Rikishi returns, and he winds up dancing with the Usos. He dances with Jey and Jimmy. If you want to see, again, an interesting visual of Jey and Jimmy Uso in 2012, what a difference, right? So Rikishi, in 1 minute and 10 seconds, gets the win there. AJ and Daniel Bryan, AJ Lee that is, and Daniel Bryan got the win over The Miz and Eve Torres in 3 minutes, all right? Ryback versus Jack Swagger was a match that was set, but it never got started. I don't know what happened there. You guys will have to go back and watch. I have no clue. But the match never happened. So the big guy, Ryback, Jack Swagger, never happened. Brodus Clay defeated JTG in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And then CM Punk defeated the Big Show by disqualification in 9 minutes and 20 seconds. So, again, you think about Raw moving forward. And certainly you had some shorter match times than you're used to because it is a 2-hour versus 3-hour. But I still think we're doing okay in terms of comparing this week's Raw and perhaps the future of the 2-hour Raws to that era of Raw back in 2012 in terms of like the flow and the match times and all that. Quite a bit different still. So there you go, guys. There are some thoughts on this week's Raw and the July 16, 2012 edition of Raw. There's a bonus you didn't know you were getting on this video. But let me know what you thought. Were you pleased by this Raw? Did you also kind of notice some of the things with the commercials, the timing, those kind of things? And again, I think it's an obvious adjustment period, but still, you've got some big storylines coming out of this, and we are on the road to Crown Jewel now, and then, of course, to Survivor Series. So let me know your thoughts on this week's Raw. As always, appreciate your feedback. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button on your way out. Like I mentioned, follow me on Twitter at WrestleBlake. We're discussing all the fallout from Raw and other things as well on there. So I appreciate you guys watching as always. Let me know your thoughts on this week's edition of WWE Raw.